Друзья,
Hello
здравствуйте.
there, my friends.
Сегодня я хочу
Today I want
поговорить
to
о такой
talk
вещи.
about emotion. We all experience emotions. We live in a world of emotions. There are numerous ways of defining what an emotion is. There are scientific definitions. There are even strange phrases such as emotional intellect. But none of this leads to any desired result. So let's start right at the beginning. Let's try and sort out what emotions are. Imagine this situation. You're a mother. You have a child, a pupil in his 6th grade of school. It's morning, you've woken up, you're in a good, slightly elated, positive mood. You're making breakfast. It's time for the child to get up for school. You say in a kindly voice, "Jack, up you get, please. You're going to be late for school, dear. Wake up." Jack lifts his head, looks at his mum, listens to her tone of voice, and goes on sleeping. Obviously, he doesn't want to get up. 3 or 4 minutes go by, you realize that time's running out, but the child goes on sleeping. So, your state of mind becomes one of slight concern, and you say a little bit more loudly, "Jack dear, get up, you're late." Your state of mind has already changed somewhat. Your anxiety has become more intense. Jack ignores you and goes on sleeping. A few more minutes pass by, and you realize that the child really is getting late for school. This could cause problems for you. So your state becomes one of irritation, and you say in a strained and threatening voice, "I've told you, get up now." Jack realizes that now some sort of punishment could be in the offing. Mum is already pretty angry. It's time to react. He gets up and gets dressed. What's happened? When you woke up, you were in a good mood. Then you became involved in an interaction with the child. The child refused to obey you. To start with, you tried to appeal to his reason. "Jack, get up please, otherwise you'll be late." He didn't react. Then you became slightly anxious. You felt emotion, slight alarm. In that state, you said, "Get up." And again, he didn't react. So that triggered the next state of your nervous excitation, the first stage of anger. And only at that moment did he obey you. So what actually happened? The child was afraid you'd impose sanctions for not carrying out your request. That is, you frightened him. Your organism was put into a state of excitation, and from a position of strength, you put pressure on the child, and the child did what you wanted. So, ultimately, what is emotion? Emotion is the reaction of our organism in response to events happening around us. Something has happened, and we've reacted to it. And how have we reacted? Our state has changed, the level of excitation, and our consciousness has changed. You made a transition from a state of joyful, low-level excitation to one of aggression, dissatisfaction, and anger, and only then did you achieve the result you required. That means that emotion is ultimately an energy-driven reaction in response to certain events happening in the external world. Or something might happen inside us, purely in our imagination. Our organism reacts identically to such an event. But how does such a reaction take place? Spontaneously or in accordance with a specific program? It turns out that there exists a specific algorithm in accordance with which any change in our state takes place. A certain event has taken place. Your child won't get up for school and might be late for lessons. Your loved one hasn't been in touch with you by phone all day. Your parents are preaching at you again. You've been given the wrong job at work, or something else has happened. Concerning each of these and a multitude of other situations, you have an expectation of what ought to happen and how. You know when your husband should get home, when your child should get up, what job the boss should give you, how your parents ought to talk to you, and so on. In numerous situations, we know what ought to happen and how. Events can develop in one of two directions. In the first, the situation coincides with our expectations or even exceeds them somewhat. For example, you're expecting your child to come home from school with a good mark. He arrives and says, "Mum, I've received 2 excellent marks today." Reality has matched your expectations. What will your reaction be to this welcome event? Your reaction will be joyful. Your energy level will be raised. You're joyful and say, "Well done, clever lad, there'll be a present for you," or something equally nice. You have experienced joy. Or the other case. You are expecting your husband home from work at 8 p.m., but he's arrived at 7:45 and presented you with flowers. You are overjoyed because reality has exceeded your expectations. It sometimes happens and we react to it. Our emotional state changes, and the emotions which arise as a result are called positive emotions. But, unfortunately, in life it happens quite often that reality doesn't coincide with our expectations. That is, something happens which we hadn't expected. Reality doesn't match up to your expectations. Here we can react in one of two ways. We can enter a state of excitation, but an aggressive one. Or we can suffer a total collapse in our energy reserves. That means that your reaction can be one of two types. The first reaction is to go and correct the situation using force. The second is to lapse into a state of depression, and it's not possible to do anything about the situation. In other words, the two modes of reaction are represented by the middle branch of the algorithm. Can I influence this? Can I correct it? That is, if the person has the feeling that he can influence the situation, then the organism will give him additional energy. He will enter an excitatory state and, from a prior position of strength, will attempt to exert pressure on his adversary to act in the way he considers to be correct. So, for example, your husband has come home late. You become angry, you raise your voice to him, you have a row with him. That is, you frighten him. He has to be afraid of you, so that next time he'll come home when you want. Your child has come home from school with a mark you didn't expect. You become angry, raise your voice, put pressure on him. The child is scared. In future, he'll be afraid to bring home a mark you're not happy with. Your boss hasn't given you the right job. You feel he's not behaving correctly. You are provoked, you start to argue with him to prove that he's made a mistake. Obviously, you can't frighten him, but maybe you can convince him. He sees your resistance, starts listening to you, and possibly will cancel the job, but maybe not. He may hear you out and say, "Come on, finish it off, then we'll iron things out later." You go away, but you're boiling with indignation inside. What an ass, he doesn't understand anything. That isn't an appropriate task for me, but for someone else. Why does he do things like that? And so on. In other words, various situations occur in which we enter into a conflict and the organism provides us with energy to enable us to achieve victory. Who's doing this inside us? What part of our organism is participating in this? Who's dragging us into this struggle? To answer this, we need to turn to neurophysiology. It turns out that neurophysiologists divide the brain into three sections, or three types of brain. The first of our brains is the reptilian brain. This brain appeared amongst living creatures around 40 million years ago. This brain is responsible for survival. It's the seat of our instincts. In a human being living in a dangerous environment, this brain is fully formed. For example, as soon as a child is conceived in the mother's womb, it's the reptilian brain which is the first to develop. The next brain is the so-called limbic brain. It's responsible for the emotions, that is, for those states which we experience in our bodies. It would appear that this brain controls those glands which create those or other states in our bodies. And the third brain is the new brain, or the neocortex. This brain is responsible for our logic, thinking, and imagination. This is the young brain, to which neurophysiologists attribute an age of about 40,000 years. It distinguishes us from the animals. Whereas the animals are poorly endowed with this brain, in humans it's quite large and takes up the maximum possible space in the skull. It's our consciousness. So, who is it that puts us in a state of anger or offense? That's the reptilian brain. It's constantly monitoring what's happening around us and comparing it with our expectations as to what should happen and how. As soon as it sees that something is happening which we don't accept, which contradicts our expectations, it perceives it as danger and reacts instantaneously. The way it reacts is always the same: to change our energy state. In other words, to change our energy level. Either it raises our level of excitation or it induces a state of passivity. When the reptilian brain sees that the child is not getting up and might be late for school, it assesses that as danger. It provides us with additional excitation so that we can influence the situation from a position of strength. Probably it gives the command to react to the limbic brain. The limbic brain sends signals to the glands, and the glands release adrenaline and other necessary hormones into the blood. We enter a state of excitation, and as a result of this state, we'll exert pressure on another person, forcing him to do what we require. That is, those of our emotions which we call negative constitutes the mechanism with which we use force to influence situations not to our liking. In other words, the intention behind these emotions is the most positive one, to bring it about that everything happens in accordance with your admirable expectations. Only the means employed are not very positive: coercion and fear. If initially you're in a calm state and then something happens which is not to your liking, your state will change to one of slight excitation, agitation, or anxiety. If that state is not sufficient to change the situation, your level of excitation will be raised. You'll become irritated, then angry, then furious. It turns out that this is one and the same emotion, only we describe it with different words depending on the extent to which it manifests itself. It's essentially the same thing manifesting itself at different levels of excitation of consciousness. What's the purpose of this excitation? To make reality conform to our expectations. We know what should happen and how. You know how your husband should behave. You know how your child should behave. You know how your parents should behave. And you know how your boss should behave. And you know how your subordinate should behave. You know how you should look and how much you should weigh. You know how much you should earn, and so on. We know everything. And when something happens which doesn't conform to our expectations, our reptilian brain is activated and takes action. Its logic is simple. Attention, danger, order has to be quickly restored. It's an outrage. Why has something happened which shouldn't? It needs to be corrected forthwith. We become agitated and attempt to restore justice as we see it. It's a quintessential caveman reaction which we've inherited from a distant past when humans struggled to survive. If something happened which you didn't agree with, the only means open to you would be to take a stick and give your adversary a thrashing, to prove you're in the right. And since the reptilian brain hasn't changed its logic over the last million years, its reactions are still at that original caveman level. So it turns out to this day, our lives are governed by this same caveman logic. If something happens which we find unacceptable and we sense that we could influence it, then we enter a state of excitation, irritation, and so on, and we try to correct the situation by force. If our reptilian brain comes to the conclusion that everything's useless, that we can't influence anything, then it reacts differently. It reduces our level of excitation, and in the animal, it's called playing dead, to avoid being touched. When does the reptilian brain react by lowering the level of excitation? This occurs when something happens which we're unable to do anything about. For example, as a result of a global crisis, your business collapses and no one is at fault. Your loved one falls in love with someone else and marries her, and there's no possibility of winning back his love. Someone has fallen seriously ill or died. You've expended a lot of time and effort trying to change a situation, but it's all turned out fruitless. In general, something happens which it's impossible to correct. That is, there's no point your reptilian brain putting you in a state of excitation, because there's no way you can act on the object and change its state in the way you require. In such a situation, the reptilian brain simply removes all your energy in order to protect your life. If it gives you the additional energy, you'll enter a state of readiness for a struggle, but there's no object which you can direct your dissatisfaction at. That means that you might turn your aggression on yourself and commit suicide. To protect your life from such an inappropriate act, the reptilian brain brings about a reduction in your energy level so that you're not able to attack yourself. There are several emotions which correspond to a reduction in energy level: despondency, apathy, depression. But in fact, they're the same state, manifesting itself in us at different energy levels. If we're not able to forget our failure, we end up in a state of depression, Depression is a protracted state which can last for several years. Depression will last until such time as we stop perceiving our failure as a tragedy. As soon as we adopt a more light-hearted, calmer attitude to it, the reptilian brain will return us to our normal energy state. By means of simple procedures without medication, one can recover from depression and return to a normal state after only 2 to 3 months. As you'll understand, emotion is a short-term reaction of the organism to a situation. Emotions pass quickly. They flare up, then fade away. This is broadly how we function, and how the reptilian brain, that is our instincts, controls all those reactions. Correspondingly, people can be divided into strongly instinct-driven and weakly instinct-driven. Strongly instinct-driven people are those whose behavior is strongly influenced by the reptilian brain. It actively participates in the taking of decisions. Sometimes the reptilian brain even takes the majority of decisions. According to some scientists, even in contemporary society, most decisions are taken by the reptilian brain. It's this brain which evaluates whether it needs to intervene in our lives, whether we live in a dangerous environment and need protecting, or are completely safe. I think that Russia is a country which is not, and never has been, particularly safe, so the level of instinctuality of the population is higher than average. Almost all the countries of Asia, Africa, and Southern Europe have highly instinct-driven populations. The reptilian brain of the majority of the inhabitants of these countries participates fairly actively in the making of decisions. But there are countries with a very high level of security, probably the countries of Northern Europe. Here there are very good social services, an effective police force, a high level of material prosperity. People have confidence in the future. Therefore, their instincts are dormant because they're not needed. The reptilian brain is inactive because these people don't need protecting. But, unfortunately, in the event of real danger, they show themselves to be completely helpless. If we recall the situation in Norway involving Breivik, who turned up at a children's camp and shot a policeman and more than 80 children, it's a dreadful story, of course. These children did not know that the world is dangerous. They were not able to react to danger. They lived in an absolutely safe environment, and when danger arose, they weren't prepared for it. If Breivik had attempted to enter a children's camp somewhere, for example, in Iran or in Afghanistan, and wanted to start shooting at children, I don't think he'd have had any success. Probably guards would simply have stopped him getting through to the children. And even if he'd got through to the children, they would have started saving themselves, instead of waiting to be shot at. These people are always aware that the world is dangerous, and that it's necessary to be ready to defend yourself. Their reptilian brain is always on the alert and protects their lives. As a result, it turns out that any negative emotion results from the activity of our reptilian brain. Positive emotion probably results from the activity of our limbic brain. Why have I been talking about this for so long? Because this caveman logic of the reptilian brain creates big problems for us in our contemporary social conditions. What sort of problems? Those which arise when something happens which is not to our liking, and our reptilian brain reacts by raising our level of excitation and saying, "Go and give him a thrashing, frighten him, force him to behave in the way we require." But, for example, suppose your boss doesn't behave correctly. Can you allow yourself to thrash him or even shout at him? It's doubtful. Some people take the risk, but usually end up losing their job. So the person restrains himself, although emotions of indignation are boiling away inside. Shouting at a loved one is also dangerous. You might be misunderstood. It might have unpleasant consequences, although many people do allow themselves to do this. Shouting at a child is a simple way of influencing while he's still small, but when he grows up, trying to frighten him by raising your voice no longer works. Shouting at parents isn't a good idea either, although there are people who allow themselves to do this, and so on. That is, our world has changed. The rules of human behavior have changed, and in today's world, physical force and the threat of violence are not possible ways of influencing other people. People have come to an agreement about how they're going to live. Ultimately, they've established certain norms of behavior, norms of morality, a criminal code. Therefore, we keep ourselves in check. even though we're displeased with the way the situation is developing. But what happens when we restrain ourselves? Something happens. For example, the boss offends you, or does something which you find completely unacceptable. Your reptilian brain is aroused and says, right, let's sort things out. It puts you into a state of irritation, or possibly even rage. But you can't unleash this rage onto your boss. You can't use it. You restrain yourself because you are governed by corporate rules of behavior. Your hands are shaking with indignation. Your blood is boiling. Your hair's standing on end. But you can't open your mouth and express everything you think about this person. You go away, but your indignation stays with you. People see your aroused state and say, yes, that's really bad. Okay, calm down. Forget about it. Don't react. This is the usual advice you get in everyday life. What happens when you say to yourself, okay, I'll calm down. I'll calm down. Following its caveman logic, your reptilian brain comes to the conclusion that today you're not able to smack your boss because your enemies are more numerous and they're stronger. But you're in the right, so in the end you're going to have to defeat him. And so that you have a reserve of strength for a future skirmish, it gives the command to store the energy triggered in the body in the form of a sort of clot, an emotional charge. It's called an unrealized emotion. It's deposited in the body in the form of a certain clot of energy. It's similar to a compressed spring which is ready to provide energy at any moment. It's called an emotional block. In fact, it's a bodily cramp which has been deposited somewhere in your body. If it's just one of two emotions, that's nothing terrible, just 2 micro cramps. An emotional block consisting of these is very minor. But what if there are tens, hundreds, or thousands of such emotions? Over years of interaction, people accumulate thousands of emotions over one and the same issue. They're deposited in the same place in the body, and a large mass of these cramps or small emotional blocks are formed. And all these blocks together form a large emotional block, directed against a specific person with whom you've been struggling unsuccessfully over a long period. That is, you might have a large block against a husband or wife, against parents, against your brother or sister, against the government, against your appearance, against yourself, because people very often struggle with themselves. Any dissatisfaction with or grievance against yourself is a struggle with yourself, aggression directed against yourself. What actually is the meaning of this emotional block? For example, you've been struggling unsuccessfully for a long time with your excess weight. You know how much you should weigh. It's an expectation of great importance for you. When you look in the mirror, you see that reality does not coincide with your expectations. As a result, you feel anger against yourself. The organism is giving you energy and saying go and give that excess weight a thrashing so that it'll tear itself off your body and clear off somewhere else, and then everything will be alright. The intentions of an emotional block are always fine. Restore order by force. Bring reality in line with your expectations. But how can you frighten your excess weight? It's impossible. Your anger does not produce any positive result. As a result, most people accumulate a huge quantity of blocks in their bodies, sometimes possibly hundreds, sometimes thousands. They're inside us, they're stored in us right from childhood. As a result, by the age of 40, a person might have accumulated in himself several hundred small and large emotional blocks. Small blocks arise when you've been deceived, insulted, left out of consideration, and so on. If your struggle over some issue has been protracted, or something has happened which you find totally unacceptable, infidelity, betrayal, bankruptcy, large emotional blocks might arise. As a result, you'll have tens or hundreds of small and large emotional blocks inside you. When a person has many emotional blocks, what happens to him? What problems arise? Blocks have several negative consequences. In the first place, the energy level of the body is reduced because the blocks are distributed in various parts of the body. It could be in the head, the thorax, the stomach region, the leg or knee, the shoulder or the spine. According to the teachings of Chinese healers, our bodies have a multitude of energy channels along which energy, our life force, is supposed to flow. When the body is obstructed by emotional blocks, It's difficult for this energy to pass between these cramped tissues. As a result, the energy level of the person drops. So a man of 40 to 45 might already be permanently tired. He seems to be working well, he wants to go somewhere to carry out some tasks, but he hasn't the strength for it. He's always wanting to lie down and rest. Passivity and apathy take over. Doctors call it the midlife crisis. One of the reasons for this crisis is a lack of the energy needed for strenuous activity. And there's no energy because his body is overloaded with emotional blocks. If the blocks are removed, the person becomes energetic and active, and can progress with his life for decades to come. The next problem caused by emotional blocks is that diseases arise in places where there are a concentration of blocks. An emotional block is a real bodily cramp. If such a cramp establishes itself in one of the inner organs, the lungs, the heart, the thyroid, the liver, or somewhere else, a cramping of the tissues will occur at that place. As a result, the blood flow at that point will be interrupted, and sooner or later, an organic disease will arise there. We go to a doctor and report a pain. The doctor tries to cure us with medication, but the cause of the condition is that our negative emotions have been deposited in the form of bodily cramps at the place where the pain occurs. When we remove the emotional blocks, then illnesses which have been specifically caused by them quite often pass of their own accord. If there haven't been very significant changes in the tissues, of course. If there have been large changes in the tissues, in that case medication will start to help. But whilst the emotional block is still in the body, the medication might remove the symptoms of the illness, but not the cramping of the tissues. If the cramped tissues can be accessed for massage, then it's possible to knead the blocks and remove them. There's a whole area of psychotherapy in which massages are carried out and blocks are removed. But a large number of blocks occur within the thorax, which is not accessible, or in the head, resulting in various kinds of migraine. Illnesses of the head whose nature is not understood. Probably certain emotions regarding a particular issue have lodged themselves in the head. A third problem which creates large emotional blocks is that they control our behavior. A large emotional block can easily, against our will, drag us into recurrent conflicts. Let's say a wife and husband have been rowing with each other for 5 to 10 years. As a result, in each of them, a huge emotional charge directed against his or her adversary has been formed. And each such charge has a laudable purpose: to explain to the adversary how he or she should behave. The husband knows how his wife should behave. The wife knows how her husband should behave. At the sight of the adversary, the emotional block in the wife's or husband's body is activated and dictates to them, go and explain to them once and for all how they should behave. This triggers a state of excitation in her, and she starts rowing with her husband. Somehow at one of our training sessions, a lady related the following. My husband and I are always arguing. We don't want to get divorced, so sometimes we sit down together, and I say to him, listen, why are we always arguing? Let's stop arguing. He agrees with me. Let's stop arguing, of course. I'm fed up with it. We've come to an agreement, and content we go about our business. But after a couple of hours, I see that yet again he's chucked his slippers somewhere he shouldn't, or hasn't put a glass in the right place, or he's failed to do something else. And then irritation wells up inside me, and I start telling him off. He interprets my words as aggression, an attack on him. His energy level is raised, and he starts answering back. As a result, we start shouting at each other. When this shouting is going on, the husband, with the best of intentions, wants to explain to his wife how she should behave. But the wife wants to explain to her husband how he ought to behave. The form which this concern takes is quite strange. No one hears anyone else, so the clash doesn't lead to any result. As a result, the emotional blocks merely get stronger, as the energy triggered in the body by the conflict is transmitted to them. In the workplace, situations arise where, for example, the boss, for some unknown reasons, persecutes a subordinate. Moreover, the subordinate might remain silent. As a result, he'll look like the innocent victim of an abnormal manager. But if we get to the bottom of this, it transpires that the subordinate considers the boss to be an idiot who's not up to his job and doesn't give instructions correctly. This subordinate has accumulated quite a large emotional charge in himself, and the sight of the boss causes this charge to be activated. He experiences negative emotional excitation. It's long been known to scientists that each of us is a unique energy transmitter, emitting into the environment a very wide spectrum of electromagnetic waves with a total power of 1 kilowatt. These radiations convey the aggression, the attack on the boss. The reptilian brain of the boss picks up these attack vibrations from the subordinate and reacts to the danger. It puts the boss into a state of excitation, and the boss starts to persecute this subordinate because he has the authority to do so. People around them, not seeing an obvious conflict, will say, well, this manager is persecuting this person for no reason. He's such a decent chap, just sitting there quietly, and yet he's being persecuted all the time. In fact, an unseen conflict is going on between the boss and the subordinate. But since the boss has more power, he persecutes the disgruntled employee. If the subordinate removes his emotional block directed against the manager will cease paying attention to him. This is a frequently recurring situation. That is, the third problem caused by emotional blocks is that they drag us into conflicts against our will again and again. They control our behavior, take over our bodies, and embroil us in conflict. A fourth problem caused by emotional blocks is that they prevent us from changing ourselves. Let's say you want to improve your self-image, but you've been condemning yourself over a long period. You've been castigating yourself frequently for being weak, lacking in confidence, not being able to stand up for your rights or demand something for yourself. You've been struggling with yourself for a long time, and a huge emotional block charged up against yourself has developed inside you. What's the purpose of this block? To change you by force, to grab you by the scruff of the neck so you'll change and become a self-confident person. When you start doing something, working with affirmations and positive convictions, or attempting to reprogram yourself, this emotional block feels that you're hindering it. Its task is to change you by force, but you want to achieve this goal by other means. If, heaven forbid, you achieve the desired change, then the existence of the emotional block ceases to have any point and the block disappears. But this is not what it wants, as it hasn't yet fulfilled its task. So the emotional block starts to act against you in your independent attempts to change yourself. It distracts you from the work of changing yourself, sends you into stupors, and so on. This happens quite often, and it's one of the powerful mechanisms which resist our changes. In other words, emotional blocks prevent us changing, prevent us from developing those qualities which we want to have. The next problem caused by emotional blocks is that many people have a perpetual flow of thoughts in their heads. There's a constant struggle going on in their heads. Someone is trying to prove something to someone else. They're ruminating on past failures, trying to work out what should have been said or done. Where does this struggle inside us, all this constant noise, come from? It's caused by the emotional blocks. It brings up past failures and starts discussing what should have been said or done in order to have been successful, or what should be done in the future. It's constantly engaged in directing your attention and energy into endless discussions. As a result, your mind is overtaken by an endless flow of uncontrolled thoughts. As soon as you remove the emotional blocks from your body, calm is automatically established in your head. You don't need medication or the application of practices over many years to create inner calm. You simply remove the emotional blocks and achieve what Eastern practices take many years to achieve. You can achieve it in 1 or 2 months. And lastly, when you clear your body of emotional blocks and stop the uncontrolled rush of thoughts in your head, the possibility of communicating with your subconscious is opened up inside you. It's called controlled intuition. You can ask your subconscious questions and receive answers. Many people succeed in doing this. It won't be at the level of clairvoyance of Baba Vanga or Edgar Cayce. You're hardly going to be able to see into the future, but you'll easily be able to receive answers and recommendations concerning your current situation. You'll acquire a good and benevolent interlocutor who will always be with you. Establishing conscious contact with the subconscious is not difficult. You merely need to carry out a series of exercises. But without cleansing your body of emotional blocks, it's impossible to communicate with the subconscious. You'll receive very strange and incorrect answers. Your emotional blocks will be participating in your inner dialogue. As you can see, from one point of view, emotions adorn our lives. They make it richer, brighter, fuller. They are characteristic of highly instinct-driven people. Rational, less instinct-driven people are usually less emotional. They employ reason, the neocortex, when making any decisions. There's no control of the energy level, which is controlled by the instincts. The more highly emotional you are, the less restrained your reptilian brain is, and the more it participates in the control of your behavior. The less emotional you are, the more rational you are, and the less your reptilian brain interferes in your life. You're a person who is in large measure controlled by reason, that is, the neocortex. Is it possible to influence one's instinctuality and the emotionality which flows from it? It is. If you're excessively emotional, it's possible to work in various ways on your evaluation of your insecurity. Explain to yourself that you live in a safe world. There are techniques for doing this. And in that case, your instinctuality and the emotionality flowing from it are reduced. You start to make decisions more calmly. But by doing this, you lose a certain quantity of emotions. For many people, this is unacceptable. They are addicted to emotions, to strong feelings. It's a sort of adrenaline dependence. No other way of life is of interest to them. By choosing such a life, you need to understand that having a large quantity of emotions leads to problems linked to emotional blocks. That is, in the end, illnesses and a low energy level await you, and all the other things which will shorten your life. Therefore, whether you are a highly emotional person or a highly rational one, it's still essential to cleanse your body of accumulated emotional pollutants. Please start working on it. How do you do this? There are quite a lot of practices with which you can do this. You can watch the following videos about this. Thank you for your attention.